The boots were approaching again. The door opened. O'Brien came in. Winston started to his feet. The shock of the sight had driven all caution out of him. For the first time in many years, he forgot the presence of the telescreen. "They got you too," he cried. "They got me a long time ago," said O'Brien with a mild, almost regretful irony. He stepped aside. From behind him there emerged a broad-chested guard with a long black truncheon in his hand. "They got me a long time ago." This is one of the great quotes of George Orwell's 1984, and it has intrigued readers throughout the years since the novel's publication. However, could this mean something more startling? Does this mean that O'Brien himself was once a rebel? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider what O'Brien really meant with this line. One popular interpretation of this line is that O'Brien, superficially a stalwart champion of the party in Big Brother, was a rebel of sorts, and that his own conversion came long before. But what could lead to this interpretation of the line? Well, for a start, even moderate fans will know that Orwell's world of 1984 is one of lies, where few things are truly certain. In the world of doublethink and the thought police, it's certainly possible that appearances can be deceptive. Indeed, Winston himself demonstrates this early on. He incorrectly, we later learn, thinks that Julia would not be vaporized and was a particularly dangerous type of individual who would turn him over to the thought police as soon as look at him. O'Brien, by contrast, Winston feels a deep, unspoken connection to. As a secret thought criminal himself, he feels this inner party member could be a secret opponent of the party, his very look indicating this. Of course, Winston gets this backwards, with Julia proving just as much a thought criminal as himself, and O'Brien, far from a Brotherhood member and thought criminal, he is actually a staunch defender of the party and Big Brother. Other characters too, such as Simon Parsons, are either condemned or implied to be, despite arguably earlier presenting similar solid credentials as model party members. O'Brien is an interesting case to consider given Winston's own connection to him. A very loose bit of evidence, if we can call it that, supporting this theory is that O'Brien even admits later on that he and Winston share similar minds, Winston's tormentor going as far as admitting Winston's mind even appeals to him. Of course, the beauty of the writing here is that the reader can fill the meaning of this type of observation with whatever they wish. However, one way of looking at such a line is to suggest that O'Brien too has an inquisitive or questioning mind. O'Brien is certainly a formidable intellect, the greatest known intellect of the novel, surpassing Winston and even Syme. Could such a mind really be confined to doublethink and the mental shackles of newspeak and party ideology? Well, probably yeah. Another related theory I've heard on occasion is that O'Brien is in fact a triple agent of sorts. It's true he acts as a double agent for the thought police, entrapping thought criminals, but that there's also a deeper level to the man, according to the theory. O'Brien in fact operating in deep cover at the very heart of the party and thought police. While certainly intriguing to fantasize about, however, to me the in-universe evidence and implications are heavily in support of the boring old reality that O'Brien really is just a double agent. But then what were O'Brien's words referencing in his famous quote? I certainly don't believe it's that he was a rebel in the past and brought over to the party. Unfortunately for advocates of such a theory, the text is quite direct in showing what happens to even the most lukewarm of rebels. Syme, for example, was in all likelihood vaporized simply because of his potential to commit thought crime, or that his frank manner may lead others to heresy. Parsons supposedly slipped up in his sleep, an offhand and uncontrollable outburst, leading him to the Ministry of Love. Perhaps harshest of all, Ampleforth was arrested for not removing the word God from a Kipling poem because no other rhyme could be found. Ironically, O'Brien himself explains to Winston that once one has gone astray, they can never escape the thought police. Even the unfortunate aforementioned trio were arrested and processed within the Ministry of Love. The trouble is, O'Brien simply doesn't fit what would be expected from a stay in the Ministry of Love. He exhibits none of the characteristics of a broken and reformed thought criminal. He is eloquent, thoughtful, calculating, and fervent. Later, we have Winston as an example of the results of thought crime. He is not only physically transformed, but mentally broken too, no longer capable of thinking about anything for too long. His capacity for critical thought has been simply burned out of him. Without the stimulus of pain, he is left intellectually crippled. We could argue that O'Brien perhaps went through this baptism of fire many years ago, a long time ago, as he himself says, which may mean that he has recovered sufficiently enough to become who he was by Winston's day. However, O'Brien himself shoots this fragile contention down. O'Brien comments during Winston's interrogation that recovery, that is, back to one's native state both mentally and physically, is impossible. O'Brien saying that a man would not recover from such an ordeal if he lived 1,000 years. O'Brien then, with his intellect, charisma, and great physical condition, just doesn't fit the mould of a reformed thought criminal. A good physical comparison to labour this point is between O'Brien and Rutherford. O'Brien is physically impressive, Winston describing him as having a prize-fighter's physique. Rutherford too was a large man. Winston even thinks that before his fall, he was likely immensely strong. The two men are comparable physically. However, it's clear that Rutherford is no longer the impressive physical specimen he was. Quote, "Now his great body was sagging, sloping, bulging, falling away in every direction. He seemed to be breaking up before one's eyes, like a mountain crumbling." O'Brien then clearly doesn't mean his words to be taken literally, or that he was somehow an outright thought criminal in the past. In my opinion, the usual interpretation that he has simply been a long-serving party member is the most likely meaning. The scant law evidence of O'Brien's past also supports this. There's not much reason to doubt O'Brien when he tells Winston that he jointly wrote Goldstein's book, or that he himself participated in the interrogations of Jones, Aronson and Rutherford. On the first point, I find it highly unlikely that a man trusted with the production of the book is not at least a long-serving party member, if not a senior one. O'Brien's age of around 50 allows that he would have been a young man around the time of Ingsocc's rise too. Winston thinks O'Brien is around 48, roughly a decade or so his senior, give or take a year. Luckily, we know that the rebel trio of Jones, Aronson and Rutherford were arrested around 1965. Given this, we can roughly estimate O'Brien was around 29 to 30 when he participated in their interrogations. Even if Winston is a bit wrong, say O'Brien is a man in his early to mid-50s, then that still gives us a man in his early 30s at the time. The point here is that, as with Goldstein's book, O'Brien's participation in this particular set of interrogations suggests he was not some low-level party man, but at least a rising star, if not already a senior party member even back then. This some 2 decades before the novel's date. In Part 1, Chapter 3, we have a shakier foundation date for the party itself. Winston believes he had not heard of Ingsoc before the year of 1960, 5 years before the last leaders of the party were purged. To be fair, he also concedes that the party could have existed in another form before this date, simply being known as English socialism in its old-speak form. Working on the theory that the party truly emerged as a force around the later 1950s, and certainly by around 1960, that means O'Brien would have been a young man in his 24th year, or perhaps in his early 20s. Unlike Winston then, he was a fully grown, if perhaps impressionable young man during the party's rise. Given he emerged on the right side of history, so to speak, by Winston's day, we can assume O'Brien was a supporter of Big Brother, the persona or the real man. We know that Goldstein was driven out and that Jones, Aronson and Rutherford were the last main leaders left when they were purged. Strictly speaking then, O'Brien is most likely quite sincere when he says that they really did get him a long time ago. He was seduced early on, from what we can tell, by the faction of the party that won out, the inheritors who made the revolution to secure absolute power for the sake of power. So that was my take on this famous line, but what do you think? Is there a deeper meaning to O'Brien's words, or do they simply mean he was converted early on in his life to the ideology of Ingsoc? Write your thoughts in the comments, and remember, if there is hope, it lies in the proles.